Well, it is an enormous pleasure to do this, but I only just finished the last slides a couple of seconds ago, and I have to say, to be honest about this, I've nicked quite a lot of the material from the meeting I was at yesterday, which was the French Menopause Society in Paris, and they are literally streets ahead, like light years ahead of anything that we're doing, or much of certainly what NICE is doing in the UK, and they're absolutely world-class lectures, and easy to understand and very, very clear. So there'll be a few French slides in here, but then that's fair enough because many of the French slides just use the English language slides. So I'm going to talk about the good aspects of the NICE Menopause Guidelines very briefly because they're fairly obvious. We'll also talk about what I call the bad parts of it, the ones where they haven't quite got it right, or they've given the wrong sort of emphasis, or they've missed things. But then the really ugly stuff is misinformation. And that's utterly unacceptable. And the British Menopause Society have said so in their letter that they put, a press release that they put out. So basically, we're going to be talking very briefly about stuff that we know is correct and accurate, a little bit about omissions and overemphasis, and then really go into detail about the most important untruths and incorrect misinformation that's actually in the current NICE guidelines. You know, you thought they would have got it right, but that ain't necessarily so. So I think mostly we know all of this stuff, and it's very nice to know that the NICE guidelines have actually emphasised HRT and MHT, menopausal hormone treatment, as the first line for any menopausal symptom. And that, interestingly, that wasn't in the NICE guidelines, which were the rough version, which was out for criticism, and it received so much criticism that it actually took them a year to adjust the guidelines to get them something reasonable, should we say. So we all know this, that the dose and the route should be individualised and use transdermals for those who have contraindications to oral, and there's absolutely no artificial upper limit whatsoever. So none of this, you know, only used for 5 years, stop when you're 60, lowest dose for the shortest time. All of that is completely out and has been for a very long time. It's all been disproved. They've got some good emphasis on recognising and treating the genitourinary syndrome of menopause, very important stuff, and also a new indication is lifelong use of vaginal estrogen with no side effects and no ill effects, also included as an off-licence opportunity in women who have breast cancer, which is intriguing. There's also some emphasis on the safety of HRT, or relative safety of HRT, in women who have a family history of breast cancer. Interestingly, taking HRT doesn't further increase their already slightly increased risk, but actually improves their survival, which is interesting. This is, of course, very important, and there was some tremendous stuff in Paris about nutrition, exercise, and healthy living. We've already heard something about weight today, which has been enormously useful in relation to that. Also, Mark's talk at the start was very important in relation to prevention of cardiovascular disease. Another thing that's also very important is that HRT is first line for low mood in relation to menopause, and one of the big do nots, which they emphasise yet again, is do not use SSRIs or SNRIs for low mood in the menopausal transition. And that's actually enormously important, but most GPs who are not trained in menopause seem to do that for whatever reason, of course, without mentioning, of course, that the primary effect of these drugs, in fact, is to reduce libido and prevent orgasm. I think if people knew that, they wouldn't want to take them. Finally, of course, don't use FSH, LH, and all blood tests to diagnose menopausal transition in women over the age of 45. Right, well, that's all the stuff that we know. That's very simple and straightforward. Oh yes, once again, the stuff that I tend to rabbit on about, but I'll shut up now. So interesting, the symptoms that they identify, apart from menstrual changes and insomnia, obviously vasomotor symptoms are at the top of their list, but I find that, in fact, mood symptoms, a combination of low mood, anxiety, brain fog, or cognitive issues, and insomnia are the primary reasons that women come to me for treatment of menopausal transition symptoms. They're also very good about talking about musculoskeletal symptoms, because many rheumatologists seem to ignore the fact that virtually all women going through the menopausal transition will get joint pains, particularly in perimenopause. They come cyclically, immediately premenstrually, and many people who are misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia, you put them onto HRT and all the joint pains get better, and of course the sexual difficulties are important. Okay, so finally then, I think there's one other thing. Oh yes, yes, that's the personal history of breast cancer. So that's all the good. That's all the good stuff. If I can remember, oh yes, missed what are the missed opportunities? And the BMS are quite strong on saying that they haven't had enough in the current NICE guidelines about talking about the impact of early menopause and premature ovarian insufficiency on bone, cardiovascular health and cognition. And of course, remember that estrogen is essential for cardiovascular health. You take away the estrogen and you develop all the atheroma. And estrogen also affects cognition, obviously, and bone as well. So that just isn't in the guidelines. It was an opportunity that's missed. And also another thing, of course, is that you need higher doses of HRT for women who are surgically menopausal or have POI under the age of 40. So that's actually very important. Now, something that I'm not going to go on about because it's actually a very large subject is that in the International Menopause Society meeting in Melbourne a few weeks ago, it was revealed that the new American and Australian guidelines say that you can use HRT as primary prevention for osteoporosis. Well, if you can use it as primary prevention for osteoporosis, you should also be able to use it for the other things that it's good for, which is, of course, cardiovascular disease. What about, once again, that is a huge subject and it was very well covered in France, but we just don't have time to do it today because I only have actually about another 5 or 10 minutes, absolute maximum, because you guys are hungry. Right. Oh yes, CBT. Remember when the guidelines came out last year, the #1 headline was that CBT is the panacea for absolutely everything. Well, as far as I know, CBT is not very good at preventing osteoporosis, probably not very good at cardiovascular disease, and might do a little bit for cognition. It helps you sleep. It might help you with your vasomotor symptoms. But realistically, what is the waiting time for CBT in the average NHS list? Come on, GPs, you know this.
9 months.
9 months or 9 months a year, okay, fine. And so really it's very interesting also that they were very selective as to the evidence base that they used. Mostly they were going for RCTs. And it's strange that they were able to accept far less stringent evidence base for CBT than they were, for instance, for breast cancer, for cardiovascular protection, etc. So, okay, CBT, yes, that's fine, but it's not going to help you with most of the things that happen in menopause and the menopausal transition. Okay, so what about the really bad stuff, the ugly stuff? What's misinformation? Well, they say that HRT has no effect on cardiovascular disease, which we know to be wrong. It has no effect on total mortality, apparently. It also has a slightly higher breast cancer mortality, which is wrong. And apparently there was a small point about combined HRT causing more ovarian cancer. Let's just deal with that straight away. Very simply, this was the quote, and it's wrong, and the BMS said so. Here we are. It's incorrect. There was an RCT from wherever it was, which found no significant increase in risk. So we can stop worrying about ovarian cancer in relation to HRT. Well, you can't stop worrying about it because, of course, people have got ovaries, they're going to get cancer, and it presents late. But just very briefly, we'll deal with that, take that out of the way. But the really big thing is HRT effect on cardiovascular disease. Now, we just had a very interesting slide and detail about how cardiovascular disease, how important HRT is for cardiovascular disease. You may not have seen it, but I'll show it to you. So what they actually say is, when discussing HRT as a treatment option for menopause-associated symptoms, explain that overall, taking combined HRT is unlikely to affect life expectancy. Now, the Cochrane review, most of the studies, and also WHI now, shows that HRT, if you look at the whole picture, HRT improves life expectancy, reduces total mortality. So there's a long spiel about it, but let's go into it in a little bit more detail, just showing you a few images, if I can get them up. Oh yes, this is the other point that they said. Do not offer combined or estrogen-only HRT for primary or secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. That, I think, I'd like to show to you is in fact wrong. So our first lecturer told you why it's wrong. Estrogen prevents this. You take away estrogen and then you have to wait. And I asked Mark, how long is it before you develop all this stuff? Well, in fact, it varies from one individual to another, but the average is around sort of 5-10 years or so if you take away the estrogen completely. And so if you can put the estrogen in either straight away when the symptoms start, or at least by here, and certainly by here, then you will prevent all of this lot. And you'll do a whole lot of very good things to nitrous oxide in the endothelium, and a whole load of other fantastic things to clotting, etc., etc. So let's have a look and see what. Oh yes, we have exactly the same picture in Paris yesterday. And I'd like to introduce you to the president of the French Menopause Society, Professor Florence Trémolière, who is one of the world experts on the subject of osteoporosis, in fact, but she's going through evolution of the concepts of traitement hormonal de la ménopause. And down at the bottom here, she says, reduction in mortality if hormone replacement therapy is commenced between 50 and 59 years old. So let's just see how she actually she justifies this. She's also quite interested in the Danish osteoporosis study, which I used in my evidence, and also the Scandinavian studies on diminution of global mortality. Let's have a little look. This lovely slide it translates quite nicely into English. So what you've actually got is that if you start within 10 years, all-cause mortality, according to 5 randomized controlled trials, is reduced by 30%, and fatal and non-fatal coronary disease is reduced virtually by 50%. Now that's pretty good. If you start over 10 years, there's no increase in either of these. There's a very slight increase in stroke, but that's largely based on WHI, which used oral HRT, and remember that transdermal is not a risk of stroke. So once again, as far as stroke is concerned, there's no excess risk if you start your HRT within 10 years. So that's more or less QED that the NICE is wrong. But let's just add to that a little bit. You're all very familiar with the Danish study that was it was oral HRT in relatively slim women. Relatively, I say relative to American women, of course. And remember that the end. Actually, cardiology must be great fun in terms of doing good quality work, because it's a very robust endpoint, isn't it? And so when they stopped the trial at 10 or 11 years, because of WHI, they followed the people for another few years afterwards. And what they found was that the gap was, though there was a faster rate of decline, and the upshot of that is that you shouldn't stop HRT, because if you stop HRT, you suddenly increase your cardiovascular risk. You still got a benefit in this group, and I hadn't, when I first showed this a year ago, when I did my NICE critique, I didn't get the next bit in. Oh yeah, sorry, that's the bit I put in. And yes, the Finns have actually shown that you increase cardiovascular risk the moment you stop taking HRT. This was the same slide from Florence, and this is what this was her slide here, showing that after 10 years you halve your risk of a coronary event. So I think that's pretty impressive evidence that there's much less cardiovascular risk, and so NICE, I'm afraid, is wrong. And also, if you now look at global mortalities from another lecture, it does matter. It doesn't matter. Interestingly, it doesn't matter which type of estrogen you use. You still get a reduction, which is significant. But there is a difference between estrogen versus conjugated equine estrogen, which is significant. But both of them also reduce total mortality. But of course nobody in Europe uses conjugated equine estrogen anyway. And overall, the bottom line here is that global total mortality is reduced by about 20%. Different studies show slightly different values, but that's actually quite nice confidence limits in that particular study. So what about reducing cardiac mortality? This is the fantastic data from the whole Finnish population. And what we see is here we get a very substantial reduction for when you're starting within the, what shall we say, the therapeutic window. But in this study, remember, done on Finns who tend to be relatively slim and fairly hardy people with a cold weather and all the rest, even women in their 60s will get a benefit, and even if you start in their 70s, you seem to get some sort of cardiovascular benefit. It's quite possible that this might be a healthy user effect, but there's no doubt of the benefit here for these women under 60. Absolutely none whatsoever. And they say that you get larger coronary heart disease mortality risk reductions the earlier you start the therapy. So start soon, don't stop, and just keep going. Oh yes, and what about breast? Well, this statement here, it was important to highlight in the recommendations there's a small increase in the risk of breast cancer mortality. That's wrong, and this was a statement from BMS, which actually says this is factually incorrect. Isn't that a polite way of putting it? They're very interested in the Lancet mortality data, because remember, all that Lancet mortality data completely excluded the French data using micronized progesterone, which showed that there's no excess risk. And in fact, you don't need to read that, because I'm just going to talk about the fact that the Lancet, the Oxford Collaborative Group, I don't know whether they deliberately didn't include the French data, but they haven't been able to give us a reason why they failed to include the French data. So let's have a little look at that data. And this is the E3N, the Étude d'Éducation Nationale. This is all the teachers who are studied. It's a very, very large study. And what it shows is that if you use progesterone or its stereoisomer dydrogesterone, there's no excess risk of breast cancer, whereas if you use other types of synthetic progestogens, there is an excess risk. And exactly the same data shown at a Finnish study produced at almost exactly the same time, but they didn't use progestogens. Although an English study did relatively small numbers in that, but also showing the same effect with no excess risk of breast cancer, certainly for at least for the first 5 years. Okay, so this is the quote that NICE came up with in the original work, and basically it's completely and utterly, oh yes, they're lovely typographical error, protestogens. But anyway, that's completely and utterly wrong. So what about breast cancer survival? This has been known for 25 years odd, that if you're on HRT at the time that you're unlucky enough to get a breast cancer, you're more likely to survive it. Once again, there might be a healthy user effect there, but also the likelihood here is that if you take HRT, it might stimulate the growth, the early growth of very small micro lesions, and they're more easy to detect at mammography, and they tend to be lower histologically aggressive types, and they're much less likely to spread to the lymph nodes. So that's another possible reason. Some people, once again, have said it's just a healthy user effect, but I think the data from Scandinavia shows much better than that. That if you actually look at standardized mortality ratios for the entire Finnish population, then you can see that there's quite a substantial reduction at all ages, although not quite so much for the estrogen progesterone. This still remains significant in the 70 to 79-year-old age group. And overall, the bottom line, if you like, is that the total fatality rate is halved if you're on HRT compared to women who've never taken HRT. And I put it to you that that must be too large to be just a healthy user effect. So that's what NICE said, and I don't think it's right. So that's just about it, folks. So what are the NICE Menopause Guidelines? Well, the NICE, which is the Non-Biased Interpretation of Healthcare Evaluative Research, an institute that I actually founded last year, about 5 minutes before I started the lecture, just sort of thought of it. So basically, HRT started within 10 years is cardioprotective. It reduces total mortality, and of course, what they don't really mention is the fact that it massively improves the quality of life regardless of what it does to cancer, but in fact the total mortality is much better, and the cancer mortality is much lower than you think, or much lower than has been touted in the press. HRT à la française, as it's called, which is mostly transdermal estrogen with micronized progesterone or dydrogesterone, which they can actually prescribe in France as Dufaston, which it still have, and a lot of women are actually on transdermal and Dufaston. No excess breast cancer risk over up to 5 years, and there's a minimal excess around 10 years. But I didn't show you that slide, but that's maybe for another time. And another interesting bottom line that is in the USA and Australia, HRT and MHT can be used as primary prevention for osteoporosis. Isn't that a nice thought? Time for lunch.
Thank you.